Group 4, talking to you today about our article, Lwin et al., which I will share with the class. So this article is entitled Global Sentiments Surrounding the COVID-19 Pandemic on Twitter. And it analyzed the emotions that were experienced at the beginning of the pandemic. And it actually built a little bit on previous research that had been done even earlier this year. In March of 2020, Lee et al. Published an article called Epidemic Declaration on Psychological Consequences, a study on active Weibo users. And they were looking at Weibo users. Sarah, would you like to jump in and explain a little bit about how that article is different from this article?
Yeah. So the main difference between, or even like not just difference, but common thing that both articles have is that in the impact of COVID-19 epidemic declaration on psychological consequences, a study on active Weibo users, they focus on either positive or negative emotions. That's it. Like they don't go in depth of the different emotions they have. But on the other article, which is the global sentiments surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic on Twitter, analysis of Twitter trends, they use different types of emotions, which are sadness, joy, anger, and I think the last one is fear.
Fear, yeah.
So if you look at figure 1 on page 2, it shows the different emotions, and the researchers, they did a research about they did it global wide, to where people would go and they would say, or they would log in their emotions. And as you can see that the anger, fear, and joy, they change throughout the days, because they did the study daily, on a daily basis. But as you see, sadness stays on like one path. I do believe, though, if they were to keep going with the research, sadness would have changed. But so yeah, like it's just kind of like cool how they were able to log in the information and how people had different emotions on a daily basis just because they were at home during the pandemic.
Right. So this article is basically getting more narrow, more specific than that previous article that had been done a little bit earlier in the year, that just looked at that positive and negative. Cool, thank you. Philip and Josh, would you like to jump in and talk a little bit more about the tables and figures in this research?
Yeah, so there's two tables in this document. If you could pull up that first one. It just basically from later on in January to, let me see the day. Yeah, so later on in January, the 28th to the 9th of April, it took 20 million tweets and search for keywords, or all those tweets had those keywords in them, and it basically just logged those. If Josh wants to talk about the figures below that, which really relate to what's in that table.
So it the single day record during this time span was 873,000 tweets, which took place on March 13th. And basically, I believe this suggests that March 13th might have been like the climax, or like the peak of the scare, when all the hysteria was like, at the max, leading up to the breakout in COVID cases. And the time span of like where they studied was from January 28th to April 9th. So it's like within that time span where March 13th was like the peak. So you can see from like January 28th to like around like January 10th maybe, it was like kind of steady, like steadily pretty low, and then just like hit all of a sudden. So that was like the climax, and then it goes down a little bit, and then it's like steady around 600,000 number of tweets per day that revolves Corona or COVID-19.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
something else a little bit noteworthy I just want to point out is that actually the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic on March 11th. So it's actually really close timing there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so with that being said, table 2 took those tweets that we were talking about in the first table and those figures, and it categorizes them based off like what emotion they have. And if you're on table 2, there's a website link like right below it. It's like an algorithm that would categorize them, and that's what they did. And it basically groups them into like anger, joy, fear, sadness. And in this, it talks about how those emotions developed over time. I believe a figure also shows this, but it's basically talking about how like the public consensus started from like fear and then went to anger over time. And my like a big takeaway I got from this was that Twitter is like a platform for public discourse, really like sped up the public consensus on COVID. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Well, Danielle, would you like to talk about any of the statistical terms that were used in this paper?
Yeah, there was one that I noticed that I feel like was really important to mention, which was the term correlation coefficient, which was represented by the variable R. And basically, before, like when I was reading, I was kind of like, I feel like I've heard of it, but I didn't really actually know what it meant. So when I was reading, trying to use like context clues, I basically came to the conclusion that it tried to base the similarities from the data sets based off of like the different emotions, so like anger, fear, sadness, joy, and to how that that was very similar, or how that correlated with the COVID-19. So I thought that was very important to mention because that's basically what it's about, how COVID-19 did affect or how this started to, stir up these emotions of anger, fear, sadness, and joy. So.
Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, and how those things evolve over time. And kind of like Sarah mentioned too, it's almost like if there's a stronger correlation, then we could almost predict kind of how they would go if this study had continued, is the other thing too. So with the, changing political climate and changing, environment and the rate of deaths and everything, it would have been interesting to see how this would have continued on. Well, awesome. Does anybody have any key takeaways that they'd like to share from this article? I know, Philip mentioned one. Anybody else have anything they want to jump in and share?
Yeah, based off of what I said, like with the emotions and things like that, they actually gave in one of the tables, if you scroll down, I think it was table 2, examples of the different emotions and how that one right there, the different examples of what an anger tweet would look like, or if someone was fearful about it. Like for example, for fear, it says, I think I have 70 panic attacks every day because of how scared I am for my mom to catch corona. So I think that was an important aspect to include that way, so the audience knows, okay, so this is kind of what it looks like, and to differentiate the different emotions. So that was one of the key takeaways, probably the main one that I found interesting.
Awesome. Anybody else want to share anything?
I do have a takeaway. If you scroll back up to figure 1, I just want to say that I learned from this that generally sadness is just an emotion that experience typically. It's like a negative emotion, but it it's typically there after an unpleasant circumstance. With that being said, if you were to be in a situation where something happened, then you can be sad if somebody dies, if your pet dies, or anything like that. So it's basically just based on a situation. And also that one of the things that I learned too is that with the data that was recorded, you can never know what a person feels um during the day. For instance, I take myself, if I were to wake up in the morning, just watch TV and chill, I'm having a wonderful day, I'm very joyful. But then 2 hours later, I get bored, or I get sad, or even I get fear. So humans, like emotions, they're not like persistent. They change on a daily basis, and even like
Mhm.
hourly.
Yeah. So that would be, basically a little bit harder to predict how those would go, because it's kind of subject to the things that we encounter and experience, and everything. So that is really interesting. Does anybody else want to share? Oh,
Sorry to add on what I was saying. And it's definitely different when you have people like that have mood swings, or that people that have like just like mainly like mood swings. They're like it's a roller coaster.
definitely.
Something that I thought was interesting, I don't exactly have the answer, but every emotion, or it appears that every emotion besides fear rose in percentage like steadily over like the few month period, like this where the study took place, or when it took place. Um, and the prominence of fear gradually dropped to less than 30% of daily tweets in early April as the crisis developed. So I don't know exactly why, but I think like the mass hysteria of like, like maybe the misconceptions of the virus was worse than what it, possibly turned out to be, you know?
Hmm.
So I just thought that was interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, my biggest takeaway here is basically this study, I think, did a really good job of not only quantitatively proving, right, that this intensity of emotions can decrease or increase these four emotions, but also, they qualitatively prove. There's something else I want to put at the end in Appendix 2. They qualitatively prove that the reason why people were experiencing, for example, anger, changed from the beginning of January, or the end of January to the beginning of April. So, whereas you see anger being pretty xenophobic in the tweets there, at the end or beginning of April, it's more centered around probably like frustration because of isolation and
Yeah.
stay-at-home orders. So you kind of
Right.
see the reason for the emotions changing, as well as the amount of the emotions, or the level of them, the degree of them. So I found that to be really interesting in this
Yeah,
study.
definitely.
So all right. So thank you all, and here's Amara with a little bit more information.
So, one way our researchers were able to group together text and tweets based on emotion was through a website called Multidimensional Emotional Intensity Analysis. And basically, what the researchers did was they took tweets from real life people and they put it into this website. So, the website creates a chart, which I'm going to show you here. It creates a chart based off of your tweet, and my tweet was actually very simple. It was, today my day was crazy. So we come over here to the chart, and we have fear, sadness, joy, valence, and anger. And as you can see, it's leaning more towards fear and sadness than anything else. And if you come down here, we have our quantitative as well as our qualitative output put prospectively in data form for us. So my most felt emotion in my tweet was fear, and that was at 0.543. My least felt emotion was joy, That was at 0.438. So if we come down to our qualitative outputs, it has sentiment at negative and emotion at fear. So what's really cool about this website is it puts it into a statistical standpoint how exactly I felt in my tweet. This website answers the question of how the researchers were able to collect data during the COVID-19 pandemic. This way is a more modern and realistic approach to how we collect data nowadays.